Welcome to Brew Day. Today we're brewing some Laughing Wolf wheat beer. The first part of any brew is its grains. For this 5-gallon batch of beer, we'll use 5 pounds of pale malted barley and 5 pounds of wheat. I'm weighing the grains using an ordinary kitchen scale, 1 pound at a time. The most common beer grain is malted barley, which is barley that is dried in a special way, or malted. You might see darkly roasted grains in dark beers with chocolatey or roasted flavors. The malt is responsible for the flavor profile and color of the beer. Next, I'll add the grains, a few pounds at a time, to my hand-cranked food mill. I have it set on a coarse setting. I don't want a flour consistency. I just want to crush the grains enough to extract the maltose sugars that are found inside the grain kernels. But I also want to filter out the grains during the brewing process. The more sugar that's extracted from the grains, the higher the alcohol content, or alcohol by volume, of the finished beer. Depending on how much sugar the yeast converts to alcohol, the beer may have a sweet, malty taste or a dry and sharp alcohol taste. While the pale malt won't add much of a malty flavor, the yeast will add a little bit of a bread-like flavor and contribute to a tall and long-lasting foamy head to the beer. You'll notice I'm using a piece of cardboard as a chute to collect the grains and funnel them into a bucket sitting below the table. Now that I've prepared the grains, let's focus on the next ingredient, water. Here I am measuring the cold water in a large kettle with a wooden dowel that I've marked with the volume measurements. I'll be using about 8 total gallons of cold water to make 5 gallons of finished beer. I use a propane burner to heat half the water up for the next step, mashing. Mashing and lautering is the process of extracting the maltose sugars from the crushed grains. My mash tun is a water cooler I've outfitted with a valve at the bottom and a circular filter on the inside. Most mashes require holding the temperature steady for an hour, which is why I use the cooler. I heated the water to 170 degrees, so I'll add it to my mash tun in the extremely ineffective way of using a pitcher. Don't do this barefoot. Next, I'll slowly stir in the grains. A mash is like making a 7 or 8 gallon pot of tea. In beer brewing, the filtered grain tea is called wort. Wort is the name for beer before it's been fermented. If we mash the grains at too high a temperature or for too long, the wort will become highly tannic, like a wine that makes your mouth pucker. This recipe requires me to mash the grains at 155 degrees, so I'm stirring to bring down the temperature and dissolve the sugars. I use a digital thermometer to take its temperature to let me know when it's dropped down to 155 degrees. Once it gets there, I'll cover it and let it rest or mash for a whole hour. After an hour, I'll open the top and filter out all of the wort from the grains. You see the kettle on the floor below. That will catch the first runnings of the wort. There might be some unfiltered grains, so I'm going to open the valve into a pitcher to catch and recirculate the grains that first come out. Whoops, I spilled a little bit, and you can see that there's some grains on the bottom of the boil kettle, but it's okay. It will still taste good. I'm going to heat up some more water so that I can sparge or rinse the grains of the additional sugars that are left behind. In this picture, you can see that I've moved the mash tun above the boil kettle where I'll do the final boil. I'm doing a batch sparge, which means that I just put the water in and allow it to settle for about 10 minutes before draining it back into the kettle. Now we'll start our boil. During the mashing process, the sugars are extracted from the grains, but also our enzymes and proteins. During the boil, we'll be able to break down those enzymes and also extract the proteins to the surface, like I'm doing here by skimming some of the proteins as the boil is beginning. Then we'll add some hops. This is a pre-measured amount of hops which come in a variety of different methods, but this method are crushed up hop flours that look like rabbit food. The hops are added at the beginning of the beer to bitter the beer. We'll also add some hops at the end to flavor the beer and give it a nice aroma. After 45 minutes, I'm going to add some Irish moss. This Irish moss is a vegan ingredient that helps clarify the beer by clearing up the proteins that I discussed earlier. I'm also going to add in my wort chiller. This is a copper tubing that I've coiled around and added some plastic hoses on the end. I'll connect this to my hose line and run cold water through it when I'm ready to cool down the beer. You can see that Irish moss is already working with those proteins that are floating to the surface. Those will filter out at the end. At the very end of the beer, I'm going to add my final hop addition. This brand of hops is more citrusy because I'm going for a nice citrusy finish to this wheat beer. By adding these hops at the very end, only the aromatic oils will be released into the beer, but they won't boil for a long time and release their bitter acids. I'm going to turn off the flame because it's done boiling, and then I'm going to chill down the beer. I usually fill my sink with ice, but I have plenty snow, so I'm going to fill up the sink with snow. Then I'll connect my wort chiller, the coil copper that I'll run cold water through to chill down the beer. It's important to clean and sanitize all of the equipment that we'll be using from here on out because we want the beer to ferment in a closed and clean environment. I'm using a food-grade commercial sanitizer to clean the bucket and all of the equipment I'll be using from here on out. Once the wort is chilled down to about 75 degrees, I'll use a siphoning wand that's been sanitized to siphon the beer out of the boil kettle into my fermentation bucket. I'm doing this at an angle so that I can try to avoid any of the particulates that have settled to the bottom of the boil kettle. We've collected about 5 gallons, so I'm going to go ahead and pull the siphon out of the bucket and let it stop the flow. The last step of our brew day is to pitch our yeast. Here I'm using a brand of yeast that comes in a package that is dry. I've aerated the wort by shaking up the bucket with a lid on top. Then I'll just go ahead and pour the yeast in and let it mix in with the wort. The yeast will work over the next few weeks to digest the sugars and create alcohol and CO2. I have a one-way release valve called a blow-off tube to let the CO2 escape. The last part of our brew day is cleaning up. We'll let the beer ferment quietly for about 2 weeks before we'll check on it to see if it's done fermenting, and then we'll begin to bottle or keg our beer. Thanks for watching. Check back soon.